Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Adam Cross. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist in Southern California. Today, I have the privilege of being with a good friend of mine, Joshua Hernandez. He is wrapping up his master's in counseling, which is part of what we're going to be talking about. But I've also known Josh for 14 years now, back when we were in youth ministry together. And then, yeah, just 14 years, a lot's happened. We've come a
Yes, it
long
has.
way. You were my assistant youth minister for a bit and then did net ministries. We're flirting with engineering as a career choice for a good while, but then came over to psychology, and that's what we're talking about today. But anything else you want people to know about you or
I mean, you introduced me so well already, but I guess just to make it clear to everybody, I'm still a trainee, so I'm finishing up my master's. I'm a MFT trainee, and then hopefully, my degree is technically in clinical counseling, so I'll be getting a LPCC. So I'm a PCC trainee, but I believe I'm also pursuing a double license, so I'll be also an LMFT hopefully within the next couple of years.
awesome. Yeah. And you provide therapy in English.
Yeah, currently I'm one of the few bilingual trainees that we have at my location. So yeah, I
Awesome.
was kind of just jumping in full in the deep end of the
Yeah.
pool for that.
And what kind of client population are you working with right now? I know you do some groups, and what kind of groups?
So currently I'm at the Coalition for Family Harmony in Oxnard. So mostly they handle domestic violence and sexual assault cases. A lot of my clientele or population that I work with has to do with those themes or those needs. Because I am bilingual, it's not strange for me to also work with agricultural workers, especially in the Ventura County area. So there's definitely some needs there that I'm able to like tap into in our community here in Ventura County. And luckily, they're gracious enough to work with me as far as my Spanish. When I get tripped up on a word or something, they'll jump in and help me out and we'll get it done together. I do run a
Mhm.
small group with a co-facilitator for domestic violence support group for Spanish speakers.
Awesome. Yeah. And there's just such a huge need for Catholic therapists, but then Catholic therapists who provide therapy in Spanish, bilingual, and that, I mean, that's huge, right?
Yeah, there is. And starting out, I didn't think that was going to be like the area that I wanted to focus on.
Yeah.
Honestly, I was like, why? That's not my interest. But
Yeah.
like getting to work in my internship and getting those like the ability and the privilege to actually work with those people from my own culture and everything to answer that need, it definitely has awakened in me like almost a sort of heart for that area as well. So
Hmm.
now I find myself just expanding the area of interests and everything, right, for the
Yeah.
future. So I'm very excited
Yeah.
about that potential Spanish therapy and counseling services.
Yeah. Awesome, man. Very cool. And so I know today we're going to talk about really a little bit more of the process of becoming a Catholic therapist because you're kind of in the tail end of like your master's program, and you're getting your hours, and the next few months you're going to be registering as an associate and then gaining your hours. So I think it'd be great to talk a little bit about that process, but also some of the logistics, because I know there's a lot of people who might listen or watch this and say like, oh, I've thought about becoming a therapist, and what does that entail? But then we can also talk about just like what it's like to be a student and learning how to counsel and walk with other people, and the development that comes with that, personal and professional, and even spiritual development, I think, in that area. So, but yeah, any place to start, like any any forewarnings for people wanting to become therapists or join a program.
I would say forewarning, maybe just like repeating something that my professors repeated in undergrad, right? Was don't go into the field for trying to figure yourself out. Like,
Mm-hmm.
especially in undergrad and bachelor degree curriculum, there is a lot of like people taking those courses, it seems, right? To just kind of figure themselves out and kind of like process some of their own traumas, possibly in
Mm-hmm.
class with like everybody around. So I
Yeah.
would say probably like think about like, what your actual heart desires. Is it like, do you desire healing and do you desire
Mm.
more self-insight and more self-knowledge? Of course, that's part of the journey, right? Of going, but if that's your primary, I would suggest maybe attend to your own needs first and seek out counseling or therapy for yourself first, and then maybe come back to that question. But if your main purpose is to help others or to serve, right? If that's the majority, then I would say that this is a beautiful field to get into. It's really tough,
Hmm.
even though some people might not think it is. It's definitely tough, but it's really rewarding. But again, it is going to require those like that growth. It's going to push you places that you may not want to look at those spots necessarily. And it's all part of your healing journey as well as you're kind of learning how to walk with others in their own journeys, right?
Hmm.
So,
Yeah,
um,
that's a good point. Have you seen that where people might be in a program to heal themselves, or like, do you connect with that and you're like, oh, this is kind of different from that call to be a wounded healer for others?
luckily, in my own perspective, I never had that just because
Hmm.
like you said, I was flirting with like engineering for quite a while. I wish honestly that I would have gotten out of my way and just gone where I knew my heart was really just desiring to go.
Hmm.
And in undergrad, I did see that a lot. Like maybe 40% of the people studying psychology is probably some type of trying to figure out themselves and like the puzzle that we are ourselves. But as far as the master's program, very minimal. I think to pursue a master's and to apply and just keep up with the workload and the experience, the journey. I mean, I can't say that there's not people like that at the end of the program or finishing the program, but
Yeah.
they'd probably be close to zero.
Yeah, because I mean, it's a big investment of money and time.
Mhm.
And so you have to be pretty sure that you want to do it.
And you're kind of reminded that like, it's not you're not there for you, you're there for someone else. So
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
it gets really tough to like if you can't balance your emotions or bracket. And I think a
Hmm.
lot of people are gonna start hearing that word of like bracketing and everything. What does that mean? That's like setting up your own needs and your own biases aside and
Hmm.
just genuinely taking a look at the person in front of you and almost like jumping into their worldview, right? Into the world and kind of putting
Yeah.
on their shoes and walking a mile in their shoes, right?
Hmm.
So that's really tough, especially if you're not able to put your needs aside.
Hmm. Yeah.
And again, I think for me, the biggest challenge in my journey was like coming from a perspective of like, oh, I think I have a good head on my shoulders. I think like I would be like give good practical advice.
Hmm.
But that's also like not what the field's about. Like it's not about you
Yeah.
giving advice. It's not about you coming up with solutions. It's genuinely about you holding space for
Hmm.
the other person and to just like be almost like a mirror, right? So you're
Hmm.
reflecting their emotions and just you're there to walk with. They're the experts. You're
Hmm.
kind of just a guide in this
Yeah.
treacherous journey that we find ourselves in, right? But you're not there as a master. You're more there as like the guide. So I think for me it was the growth of like dying
Hmm.
my pride and my ego
Yeah.
and dying a little bit. That was my challenge.
It's easy to think about therapy and counseling and think, oh, I'm going to give advice and here's a solution to your problems. And it's not that we never do that, like give some like good tips and tools, but yeah, it's really not about advice giving. And it's like a lot of reflecting back and
Mhm.
encouraging clients to make their own decisions and to take accountability and take ownership and recognize that they're capable of making decisions and that they have support in doing that. And that's a big shift from just like, oh, here's what you should do. Here's the
Yeah.
right thing to do. It's, and I think I learned in my own therapy too that, there's just the reminder that God gives us dominion, and
Mhm.
like there's not always just one right answer, and we can really be looking for one right answer, but God has made us in his image and likeness, and he's given us free will. And so there's probably a lot of answers that are good and on the table, and some are more prudent than others or more helpful. but we have a lot of choices. And so I think therapy helps with that. It's like, well, here are all the options, even the bad ones. Let's name the bad ones. Versus like, here's the one right thing you need to do, right? And it's, yeah, I think it supports, even just especially from a Catholic context, like it helps form a person's conscience, but it helps also people to exercise their consciences with the grace of the Holy Spirit to make good decisions in their lives. And that's I think that's very particular to a Catholic perspective of therapy. But yeah, it's not simply advice giving, even though
No.
sometimes you really want to as a therapist. Just
And that's why we have boundaries and ethical codes, right? And I think you
yeah.
put it beautifully. It's genuinely about like empowering the client, right? So I know you mentioned that in previous videos, I believe, but like therapy is really about like learning how to have a better relationship with yourself.
Mm,
So my work is to really empower you. So like empower the other person on the other side of the room to really feel confident and like, feel loved, feel respected, feel like validated
mm-hmm.
and just like confident enough in like their own decisions and their own abilities
Yeah.
to kind of tap into that grace you mentioned with God and
Mm-hmm.
really discover their own purpose or their own
Mm,
yearnings and how to really fulfill those things. And like you said, there's
yeah.
multiple answers, right? I almost think about like the four gospels, like they're telling the same
Mm,
truth. They're
yeah.
telling the same story about the same our same Lord and Savior Christ, but it's very much different perspectives that
Yeah.
we're told right from the four
Mm,
authors.
yeah.
So just like that is just like every single person that you come across in this journey is they're very
Mm,
unique. They
yeah.
they themselves have their own talents, their own like needs, their own history, right?
Mm,
And you kind of have to work with them to like figure out like
mm-hmm.
what feels the best for you
Mm-hmm.
within the context of knowing this is probably your best route towards flourishing.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
So, I mean, that's probably a good segue into maybe asking a bit about your program. And we are not sponsored by your university, but just been hearing good things for a long time. So, yeah, you use the word flourishing, which is maybe like a a
oh, it's
buzzword. But yeah, tell us about DMU a bit and
the school I go to is Divine Mercy University in Sterling, Virginia. The program is hybrid, right? So we fly out there in person once a year it's like a 2.5, 3 year program. The rest of it is online. And it depends on the state. So there's a couple states that, do not qualify for like attendance just because of like state legislation or whatever requirements. But the school really focuses on, their pride and joy is that this is a graduate program school focus in psychology, counseling, and things like that, and serving. And one of their biggest like foundational works was, I think they changed the name, and I'm not completely sure on what the new name is, but they came up with this term, the Catholic Christian meta model of the person, right? So that's like the framework on how to view a person and how to like really understand the person. So when I was doing research about like potential schools here in California or other places, I really felt gravitated to their program just because like they required not only a foundational philosophy courses, a route of courses that you had to take alongside the psychology, but also because of that framework, right? So that they give you, and a big portion of that, like you said, one of those buzzwords that we get to throw around in that school is flourishing. So what does flourishing look like in a person? And I mean, we could really dive deep and spend probably like hours. Ultimately, if I had to describe it in like a sentence or two, right? It's how do we become and integrate all aspects of our lives into our most true self? So that's aligning to our purpose, to our vocation, to our understanding. So, for your listeners, there's got to be some foundational understanding. So, like as a human being, we're meant to be loved, we're meant to be received to belong to a community, right? We also have vocational needs, not only like the stages of like marriage, holy orders, or like single life, but like there's vocational aspects of in your creation, you're meant to have a purpose to like, have a relationship with God. And third of all, like to have meaningful work, to participate in this creation, like you said, in your society, in your community. And also we have a natural inclination towards leisure. So we also got to be receptive, not just giving, right? And that's where like maybe some people fall into a trap where it's just like, I gotta give, 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 serve, serve, serve. But it's never like receiving. It's never like being receptive to other people's like love and appreciation, right? So all those things kind of enable you to flourish. And so this program was just really, I think, aligned with my own yearning to really grow in this career and kind of have a framework of like, okay, how do I marry my Catholic worldview with also the ethical roles, guidelines, and just the job of being a counselor or being a therapist, right? How do I bring those two together in a way that's respectful, in a way that's, respects the person in the counseling or in the client chair, but also that enables me to just be there and walk with them and be a wounded healer, right? But not necessarily to give them advice or, like
Mm-hmm.
the solutions, like to not be a problem solver from a Catholic perspective.
Mm. Yeah.
But yeah, to like marry those two and really like seek out the best in the person, right? So it's just, I think that program really did a good job about melting those two into like a
Mm-hmm.
beautiful framework where we can view
Yeah.
someone and kind of just see them in the eyes of what Christ wants to see, right?
Yeah.
Especially from like a scientific, philosophical, and also spiritual sense.
And I know in a previous episode talked with Colby Young, who's also in the well, he finished the program
He
that
did,
you're
yeah.
in, and I know some others that have gone through it, and yeah, I'm always pretty jealous of the yeah, just like you said, this integration and marriage of our understanding of the human psyche and psychological theory with Catholic theology, and they do such a good job of really coming at it from just solid church teaching, and
Mhm.
the Catholic Christian meta model. Right? I don't know if it's the flourishing model officially. I've heard that thrown around.
It might be a new name.
Yeah, but that even speaks to that man has an end goal, right?
Hmm.
That there's a purpose for humanity, and there is a true self that is outside of just what we define it to be, right? Like relativistic
Yeah.
society is like, I have to find my true self, and I'm gonna be happy, and that's what I want it to be. But it's like, no, like Catholic context and our faith says like, no, like our purpose, our mission is to, going back to the Baltimore Catechism, to know, love, and serve God in this life and the
Hmm.
next, right? So we have a final end, right? We have an end goal, which also means we have a purpose in what that looks like here. And as we get to know God more, right, like just like Simon Peter, as we come closer to Christ and we know Christ more, we also end up knowing ourselves more. Right? He reveals ourselves to us in that. And so the flourishing model is really cool. I go back to the scripture quote that says, Jesus is saying, I have come to give life and so that people can have it more abundantly, right? And I think
Hmm.
it's like that flourishing and even that pursuit of healing is something we can forget about. Sometimes Catholics can confuse the theology of suffering, right? It's like we know that God works through suffering. He works, all things together for our good. But sometimes we can glorify suffering and forget that the goal is actually healing and resurrection through it. So I love this flourishing model and just the concept of it. It's like, well, what does life in abundance look like? What does healing look like? Jesus in the gospel, everyone who asked for healing, everyone he touched was healed, right? He didn't hold that back. But sometimes we can forget that. So I think DMU does a great job, and obviously their staff has created this meta model, which is pretty cool. It's like a general theory, of like psyche, Catholic integration. I'm also wondering maybe, and this is talking more logistics, but if
Hmm.
someone's listening to this or watching this and is saying, hey, I want to become a therapist, I want to become a Catholic therapist. I know I get questions about this all the time. Is what does it entail? Like your program is like how many years, and like you have to complete courses, and then what? Like what does that process look like?
So the program as a whole, right? You could go part-time or you can go full-time, and you can kind of bounce back and forth depending on the needs in your own personal life. And so I believe it's 2.5 if you're going full time. So that's my experience. I was always full-time student, work and everything else that, everybody has kind of in their daily lives.
Mm-hmm.
Going to the requirements of what does that look like? So for the first few years, right, it's almost like you're itching for getting into like the field. You're like, okay, let's learn. If you're coming in from like undergraduate in psychology, maybe some of this is like repetition. Oftentimes, some people also come in with like degrees in biology and the humanities, whatever it may be. Right. So you're really covering for the first 2 years, you're covering just modalities, theories, like people, founders of psychology with DMU. You're also like covering philosophy, right? So like the foundational works of, like, for example, John Paul II is one of the authors that we cover in one of the philosophy classes, or
Nice.
Joseph Piper.
Yeah, yeah.
Pieper? I don't know how to
Piper
pronounce
Peeper, I
his
don't
last name. Something
know.
like that.
He's
But it's a
German.
really great book. Joseph, a
Yeah.
book on leisure.
Yeah,
Um,
it's a good one.
Amazing read. I would recommend it for everybody. But yeah, so you're kind of just learning the foundation, right? And they spend 2 years like really putting the foundational work in. So the first year you're kind of learning about the legal rules, the ethical rules, again, theories like Freud, Jung, Eric Erickson, things like that, family theory, just developmental theory. So just a whole scope of just how to view persons. And I think one thing you learn while going through the program is that like all these people, to a certain extent, have truths, embedded into their theory. So there's
Mm-hmm.
multiple ways to look at a human person, but unfortunately, it's just almost like a fraction. Like they're only capturing just like a little bit of the person, right? So you're kind of learning all those to establish your foundation from where to build on.
Mm-hmm.
Second year, you're kind of learning the skills, so like how to listen and how to actually listen well, as opposed to like only hearing people to respond. It's just like how to listen to like to reflect. So, how to identify the underlying emotions
Mm-hmm.
behind something that a person's communicating, right? So, that was a huge surprise for me during my second year, is just learning how my body is in space. When I'm talking to someone, I often didn't notice that I would finick with my fingers or I would tap my foot. Um, and it's like those things could communicate like,
Mm-hmm.
well, I'm irritated, I'm kind of tired, kind of bored. So
Yeah.
you really learn how to almost have a dual relationship with your body and mind, where
Mm-hmm.
you're present to the other person and you're actively there with them. But on the back end, you also have like almost like a cognitive or mindful manager in your brain,
Yeah.
kind of seeing like, okay, where's my right hand? What is it doing? What am I thinking of? Like,
Yeah.
where's the tension in my body, right? Because you gotta listen to all those things, and you're
Mm-hmm.
kind of learning how to like read the data that you're already receiving,
Mm-hmm.
in your daily interaction with everybody.
Yeah.
Some people may come away and be like, "Oh, that didn't feel good," or "I felt really joyful after seeing this person," right? So all those things are like things that we already run into in our daily lives, but you kind of learn how to like take that data in
Mm-hmm.
and transcribe it into like useful information that you can apply in the moment. So that's a lot of the second year of just mock therapy sessions or mock group sessions, and just a lot of writing, a lot of reading. And then you have two residencies during those first 2 years. So those two usually just covers about like what therapy is, what therapy is not. The second one really focuses on like the mock therapy session. So like, you kind of start learning by doing just 15 minutes at a time, and then 30, and then that 30 turns into 45 minutes. And before you know it, you're like, wait, 45 minutes just flew by when first like when the first time you did like the first 5 minutes, right? Like just felt like the
Yeah.
longest eternity. You're like, oh my God, what is that person gonna say? Like, what's gonna come up? Like, I'm so scared. But then you find yourself like almost kind of getting into your rhythm, right? So you're kind of like uh, they're almost like putting you into like a mold, but then you kind of break out of that mold and like put in your own personality, your own style
Hmm.
behind it. And I
Yeah.
think that really starts shaping up after the second residency. So like the last year is like the higher level courses of like, family therapy, substance therapy, or like addiction counseling, child therapy, couples and family. Yeah. So all those are like towards the end, right? So at the end of your second year, you're kind of or roughly around there, you do your last residency. So in the last residency is literally all just like sharpening your tools that you kind of picked up during the second year. So during that third residency, you're literally just like uh, it's just like trial after trial after trial, like repetition, repetition, repetition to like really sharpen that tool set that like you have acquired over 2 years, give or take, before they really sent you out into the world. Then to even stop some people, I don't think anyone in my cohort was like held back, but like
Mm.
if you're not ready, that's part of
Hmm.
like their professional like responsibility as a school, but
Yeah.
also just like a requirement is like, okay, if you're not ready to like go out in the field,
Hmm.
you're gonna have to take some time before we can even let you take that next step. Because at that point, like you're in a place that you could really cause some harm if you're
Hmm.
not ready. That third year is usually like just your internship. So you're taking classes, you're doing everything that you were doing, then you got to balance all of that. But now internships, so now you're actually
Yeah.
working with clients, actually doing the work, and it's really rewarding. So it's like for the first 2 years, you're kind of just like building that itch of like, oh man, I'm
Hmm.
learning, I'm learning, I'm learning, but how's this
Yeah.
applied? How's this applied?
Yeah.
And
That's cool.
really, that third year is when they kind of let you go. They open the gates, and you're like,
Yeah.
all right, let's do the work. Like, let me actually go and serve.
That's awesome. Yeah. And yeah, every program is slightly different in how they structure it, and depending on what state you're in, you have to look at the regulations and what's going to be required of you. And I think you were mentioning too, coming into each program, there could be some prereqs if they come in from different kind of bachelor's degrees that they might need. But I like what you're saying too about like the first couple of years, you're just kind of like you're training, right? You're forming, okay, this is how I would do it, and this is what I would do. And then as that becomes really kind of cemented, but as you become more formed in
Mhm.
that, then that's where really you start acting from more of a place of self, where you're like you have less of that dialogue in your head of like, okay, I gotta do this and I gotta do that and make sure my leg's not shaking, and until eventually it's really just that becomes more of second nature to you, and you can operate from a place of compassion and really be just with your client, be present to them. And I think that's where things start to change a lot, which is really cool, where it's just like I feel confident in those skills, that knowledge I have, and the focus then turns to be, can I just be present with my client, right? And I
Mhm.
know we could maybe talk about that as a whole different podcast. It's just like the power of presence and the therapeutic relationship and rapport and all that. But I know for my program, I'm trying to remember, I think we started seeing clients pretty early on. I think it was in was it the first year? I'm trying to remember. I went to Pepperdine University, so it was earlier than what DMU does, and they put you in traineeship, and yeah, you're juggling, school and practicum and then supervision, right? So that's something that's probably helpful too. Is if you're working on a master's and either you're done or you're in the process and you're kind of a trainee or an intern, seeing clients, starting out as a therapist, you're going to be working under somebody's license, right? And so you're
Mhm.
going to be supervised, which means that every week you're going to meet with a supervisor once or twice, depending on how many clients you have. And you're going to be reviewing your client load, because your clients are also your supervisor's clients, so they're responsible. Usually your school program will have some sort of practicum supervision where you're bringing client cases to your professor. These are all other therapists, right? So they all
Hmm.
Also maintain confidentiality and you don't give away specific information about them. But these are consultations that typically happen within the therapist world and the therapist training world. It stays in this confidential place. As a trainee or an intern, you're not on your own. Different programs have different lengths. I know, like you said, there's a part-time program. A lot of schools have that and it takes longer, or there's a full-time track and it's usually 2 to 2.5 years. I think my program was just like a little bit over 2 years. And I think what's important, what you're bringing up too, is that a lot of people will be in a program like this and it's very rigorous. And so we don't want to downplay that. But I mean, people are at all stages of life, right? It's,
Hmm.
dating, engaged, married, working a full-time job or a part-time job, and really just kind of balancing that out as they need to, right? I think that's good to know for people is that it sounds like it's not, it gets harder to be working like a full-time job, especially even a part-time job, but there's some flexibility where it sounds like that there's that option, right? Because sometimes people can't just stop working, right? So that's
Definitely.
good to
Yeah.
know about. Yeah. And so then you graduate the program, and typically, I guess, kind of the quick overview is after you graduate, for anybody who's thinking about it, and again, depends on your state. So this is kind of like a
Hmm.
very loose overview for California, but to be a fully licensed therapist in California, for licensed marriage and family therapist, you need to have 3,000 hours of it's a kind of a mixture of client contact. So that would be client sessions, but that also include the 3,000 includes like note taking and trainings and supervision that you get. And so all of these different things, day-to-day therapist work, and you have to pursue 3,000 hours. You take 2 licensing tests, right? One in the first
Hmm.
year for MFT on law and ethics, and then after the 3,000 hours, you take another one on essentially kind of like a clinical case side of it, right? A lot of vignettes, and it's more about treatment planning and theory and some law and ethics in that. And I know we don't have to go into it too much about LPCC versus LMFT today, but there's also different licenses in different states, right? So
Hmm.
California is a little bit more known for licensed marriage and family therapists, which is kind of this umbrella term, so LMFTs, they're licensed marriage and family therapists, but that also definitely includes a ton of individual therapy and group therapy and everything in
Hmm.
between. There's also licensed social workers, so there's a lot of there's a lot of things we could cover. We don't have to go into it, but
I mean, some people might out there might get upset, but like I don't see a difference really. But you're essentially doing the same work. You almost have the same framework and everything, right? I think historically, if we need to get technical, LMFTs were kind of, since they were the first to kind of come to the surface, right, and be established and everything. I think it historically came out of like the disease model, kind of like the medical model of like, oh, let's treat this like illness, or like LPCCs kind of learn from that and went with like the holistic model of like the person. So you wouldn't say like a schizophrenic, you would say like a person with schizophrenia and make that distinction between the person and the disorder, right? That way you're not like identifying the person. Now, that being said, I think a lot has changed between LMFTs and LPCCs. I think everybody really works from that holistic perspective of like the person and having client respect and everything.
yeah.
So honestly, I think it's just like different governing bodies and like just like overall, just like everybody kind of wants to be. I find it really tribalistic, but that's my own perspective.
Yeah.
But I love in other states, yeah, LPCC would be like, which is stands for licensed professional clinical counselor. They're more recognized and they're kind of known like, oh, that's the person who does therapy. In California,
Mm-hmm.
it's LMFT. So like when someone sees like LPCC, they might stop and usually the question that I get when I share with someone what I'm studying, they're like, oh, so you're going to be like a school counselor? Like you're going to help with
Mm.
curriculums or like, planning courses? And it's like, well, I could, but no, that's not necessarily
I have
there's
that
like career
option.
counseling. There's career
Yeah.
counseling, which I could do, but like that's not
Mm.
necessarily, that doesn't encompass the whole the whole
Yeah.
career, the whole practice. So I think you could do a lot, like you said, with either license, even social workers, right? Like some people might think it's just like government work or like administrative job, but like really they're in the trenches with us. They're like doing the same work, hold one license over the other. And like, I think, whatever is more recognized in your state will probably be best as far as like your own practice, but it's not necessarily like, oh, I prefer this one because of so and because A, B, or C.
Hmm.
It's really just like I think who got to the state first, who got established, and that's who's
Hmm.
like kind of recognized historically.
Yeah.
At least it was my understanding when I wrote through the history. I prefer
Yeah.
to just do the work. It's like so
Hmm.
give me what title I need to like
Yeah.
whatever title you need to give me so I can work with people and
Yeah.
help them.
Hmm.
Cool, slap that title on me.
Yeah, and it's pretty common too that people have dual licenses in
Mm,
California, especially because LMFT is so popular. And yeah, there's probably different focuses of each degree, or each license that, probably would be good to for us to look into. But you're right. It's like licensed clinical social worker, licensed professional clinical counselor, licensed marriage and family therapist. We can all do psychotherapy, right?
yeah,
And different licensing boards and slightly different, variations in training, but we can all provide that same service. So
yeah. And
that's
I think,
even
like
good
you
to
said,
know.
there might be like specialization, right? While you're like
Hmm.
being cemented and
Yeah.
giving you the tools. So, like, don't get me wrong, like, depending on your degree, you might be trained a specific way.
Hmm.
But ultimately, when you get out on the field, you're gonna discover your own interests. Like, you might specialize with working with children. You might
Hmm.
specialize with like working with like older adults or just like specific communities or populations.
Yeah. Yeah.
And all those like, trainings, all those like things are essentially going to be mostly on your own or like through
Hmm.
other training facilities, training courses and everything. So it's like you almost want to just get to the dance and then you can
Yeah.
really pick like what kind of dancing you want to
Yeah.
do, right? Like you
Hmm.
really could really hone in and specialize.
Hmm.
And ultimately, it's not necessarily going to matter, at least in my opinion, whether you're like a social worker, LMFT, or LPCC, because like you might find yourself like in the same training room with like everybody from those licensings because you're
Hmm.
interested in just working with that specific population, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so that's ultimately going to matter most because that's when you really get the tools that you're like looking for
Hmm.
to serve that community, serve that population that you really care about.
That's a good point too. Like even after you complete the master's program, after you get the hours, after you're licensed, you keep learning, right?
Yeah.
And that's a sign of a good therapist is, they kind of drill it into you like consult, consult, consult. It's like keep talking to other therapists and make sure you're not an island in how you treat and pursue different research and different trainings and that's always I think as a therapist that's always the fun part is you get to see what else is out there and like once you're kind of on that track you get to pursue like what interests you and there's basics you have to keep doing continued education with your state licensing board on specific things but there's a lot of room where you get to say like how do I want to help people what models do I want to use that's where you get to dive into what's interesting which is a lot of
Mhm.
fun so I think that's the cool part is that like you're saying it's like at a certain point you really get to pursue those interests like why did I get in this field what's behind this right and that can be new interventions for theoretical models or looking at research and how different theories are applied but it can also be learning more about theology and like okay how do I better
Mhm.
understand God's intention for this person in body mind and soul and how do I meet them where they're at it doesn't stop once you get licensed it begins it's like wow now I
Yeah,
get to
no, it is.
go where I want to go with this a little bit more that's probably a good segue to maybe the last question here is how and I think you talked about this in the beginning but what kind of professional growth have you noticed right so maybe it's like less problem solving more reflecting or maybe it's like did I have to pick a theoretical viewpoint but like professionally how do you think your 2.5 years have really shaped you? But also personally, how do you think becoming a therapist has shaped you?
So I think professionally, it really does help you, one, administratively, right? So like you really got to get not necessarily perfect, but you got to be good at keeping a calendar, making sure your schedule's on, you can read it, you know what's going on. Notes have to be done a specific way, not only legally, but ethically. So like really administratively, you get to learn
Hmm.
oh, it's not just a job where I can just show up, talk to someone for an hour or 45 minutes and then just like
Hmm.
bye. There's
Yeah.
a lot on the back end that like really goes unseen, right? I think you grow from that also professionally, just like in relationship, the way that you're talking to another human being. So whether it be your client, whether it be another counselor or someone else in your clinic, office, hospital that you're working on, right? How to handle conflict resolution, how to handle so like approaching someone, how does your tone sound like, right? So like
Hmm.
you really take into account like how am I presenting myself outwardly? That gives not only respect, but also gives like dignity and shows dignity to the other person. So I think professionally is just like a lot of like just observing your own mannerisms, behaviors, and just approaching things in a from a place of love, but also respect. So you always want to be respectful of the
Hmm.
environment, the person there, and everyone around. And as far as like personally, right? So that's one of the tricky points. That's like one of the that's not only is the like reading, research, typing all those papers like a lot of work, but personally you're gonna like put some work in, right? So like there's gonna be a lot of topic that you're gonna touch that might be triggering for you, whether it be like, sexual abuse, past domestic trauma, divorce, or how to handle a person with substance abuse or things like that that could trigger your own biases or your own hurts from the past. So you really get to kind of take a peek behind your wounds and kind
Hmm.
of open them up a little bit and say like, well, what's hiding behind there, right?
Hmm.
Because like that topic, before you know it, will come up and something within you physically
Hmm.
and emotionally kind of be moved and you can't ignore that. It's
Yeah.
really dangerous to ignore that. So I want to make that clear to everybody. If you really feel something in your body, in your emotions, in your cognition, to a specific topic, no matter what it is. It could be small or large. You can't ignore that feeling. You have to sit with that and really examine why that is, because the last thing you want to do is get to the dance, right? When you're working with someone, that comes up in the middle of therapy. And
Yeah.
what are you going to do? If you can't compose yourself, how
Hmm.
are you going to help? How are you going to be present to that other person? That's not fair to them. And also,
Hmm.
that's dangerous. Like, you could really cause some harm.
Yeah.
So, I think personally, just like it required a lot of growth for me as far as like not only having more empathy for others, but only even having more empathy for myself. So,
Hmm.
I mean, I'm still working on that, right? On the empathy for myself and compassion,
Hmm.
but it does kind of force you to take a look at those wounds and say like,
Hmm.
why is that? And kind of just
Yeah.
examine okay, what's my history? Like, what are things that I'm still carrying with me? Because no one's an empty canvas. Like we all have gone through life. We all have seen one thing or another that we're carrying with us. And you kind of have to take a peek at that sack that you're carrying with you and say, like, man, this stone's really heavy. I either gotta let it go or I gotta chisel it down little by little to not carry such a big load on me, right? So I think just doing that work and not looking away is one of those like personal
Hmm.
growths where I think even my wife and my friends, have pointed out like that they noticed of just like the way that I talk about like other people or myself or just
Hmm.
about events, having a benefit of the doubt, kind of having like a step back and say like, well, why are we reacting this way? What could
Hmm.
be the cause for that, and really taking a holistic approach into everything as opposed to just be reactive. Personally, I think I could narrow it down to that as just like not being so reactive,
Hmm.
but being present and being able to
Yeah.
navigate rough waters in a
Yeah.
more respectful and confident manner of like, well, let's really examine what's working and what's going on here underneath the surface. right?
Mm-hmm.
And really
That's
get down to the source of the issue as opposed to reacting out of anger, reacting out of hurt, or
mm-hmm.
being impulsive. So, yeah, you really get some emotional management, I think, hopefully.
And it sounds like you're saying part of that personal growth is to not be so reactive and in turn kind of become responsive. This is you might notice stuff is coming up for me and this could be just in life, but it could also be with clients. And
Hmm.
reactive is just to kind of let the emotion make decisions for you. And with clients, you can't do that, right? Because that's going to limit what they can do or how safe they feel in a session. But to be responsive is to notice and observe, and even like you said earlier, to receive yourself. It's like, okay, I'm feeling this way, and why is this coming up in me, and where is this from, and then how am I choosing to respond to this, right? To my own self, but also to the trigger that's in front of me, right, or the client that's in front of
Yeah.
me. And so I think that's so huge, and it points to kind of what you're talking about is just for any therapist to be doing our own healing work,
Hmm.
and for therapists to be in the client seat. I've learned the most about therapy just from being the client, and just to have continual support ourselves. I'm a therapist with a therapist, and if therapy is about building a relationship with yourself, it's like you need that support. That's not something
Hmm.
like, okay, I'm done, right? Like I've finished therapy. It's like what I finished needing support and like knowing myself better. Right, that doesn't stop. So I think that's great that you're talking about that personal development is like being able to see, okay, like what's causing reactions in me and what do I do with that? And then the compassion piece is like, well, how do I love others? And in that process, like, how am I loving myself? And I think
Hmm.
I love the imagery of like stained glass window, right, in a church where God's grace, Christ the Son is just like pouring through the stained glass window, and we get to decide maybe what that light touches, right? And we have to really kind of allow that light to kind of pierce those dark areas in us. And we could try to hide them and try to keep them away from the light, but they're still there, and we're still going to trip over them. And so part of our own healing work is it is allowing that light to kind of pierce through, and Christ is asking us to participate in that. And like he's not going to just maybe light up a whole room at once if we don't want it. He's going to respect our
Hmm.
decision, and he's going to ask us to bring stuff into the light. And so I think that's a huge piece, like you're saying, personal development is like what's going on with me, what's coming up for me. And if you're going through a grad program for counseling and that stuff's happening to you, you're like, why is this coming up? Or there can be a lot of imposter syndrome of I shouldn't be struggling with this, I'm a therapist. And it's like that's totally part of it. That's natural, right? And
Yeah.
even if you're licensed and or graduated, like you're not gonna be a perfect person, and that's okay. Like that's as part of this healing journey is just continuing to know yourself and love yourself as God knows and loves you. That doesn't mean you're not going to make mistakes, right? It doesn't mean you're not going to be affected by your past wounds, but you keep pursuing that, God's gonna heal in that. So I think even maybe to calm some of that storm of it's easy to feel like an imposter as a therapist. And again, like you're saying, the benefit is that we're not here to give like a perfect answer or to even be like this perfect shining example. It's like, no, I'm still struggling with stuff. I'm still imperfect, but that's not why I'm here. I'm here because
Yeah.
I can walk with you. I can help you. I can give you some tools and tips, but I can help you carry that cross, just for as long as I'm supposed to, which I think is a really good reminder for anyone going into the field, right? You don't have to have it all together.
You really do.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
again, you don't dismiss your hurts, right? Because you
mm-hmm.
definitely don't want to dismiss them, but you don't want to like become so overwhelmed by them. So it's a balance of like learning how to handle those things. And like you said, but if you don't want God shining on that whole window, like little by little, you get to do the work and you kind of get to peel that scab right back
Mm-hmm.
and kind of heal that piece
Yeah,
by piece, which also teaches you how to do pacing, right? So the last
mm-hmm.
thing you want to do is get in front of a client and they have some trauma, they have some hurt, and you're like, let's dive deep into that wound open. Like, no, that's like cutting into the wound. Like that's definitely
Yeah.
not something you want to do. That's re-traumatizing the
Hmm.
present. So you kind of learn to pace. And like I said, all this is data. Like your
Hmm.
physical symptoms, your emotional symptoms, cognitions, all of
Hmm.
that is just data points. And you learn how to like decipher those points into like actual useful, pragmatic information that you're like, okay, cool, this
Hmm.
is what those mean. So their emotions, symptoms, hurts, they're not bad, they're not good,
Hmm.
or like emotions are not bad or good, right? They're just data, and you kind of learn how to like decipher what your body, what your mind is really
Hmm.
trying to tell you.
Yeah,
Um,
that's good. Yeah, taking it all in with the curiosity and without judgment,
mhm.
and making decisions based on, yeah, your values and what was important to you and your goals. Yeah, that's so important. Exercising our free will, our conscience, and doing so really intentionally and from a well
Yes.
formed perspective is awesome to consider. Even how there's a personal formation that you're going through. I mean, I'm still going through. We don't stop. It's like that personal formation and emotional maturity that's being formed that allows someone to say, this is all data, and I get to look at it, and I get to make decisions out of that place with a lot of compassion. It's like, oh,
Hmm.
I'm really struggling. Oh, this is a lot of grief. Okay. Like, it's not going to be emotionless. It's like, I really feel for myself, and how can I help myself, and what do I need? And which it's so transformative. It's love. It's beginning to know ourselves and love ourselves as God knows and loves us. And we're not doing that
Hmm.
without God. He's right there with us, and so it's a beautiful process of learning to love others and ourselves. But yeah, and I'm sure there's a lot more we could talk about in terms of programs and stuff like that, licensure. But I think this has been a great overview, just kind of talking about the process. And again, if anybody has any questions, it's good to look at what your state requires and different regulations and licensing steps, programs. DMU is a great option. Plug in Pepperdine just because I went there too. But there's a lot of good programs, and especially for that Catholic Foundation, DMU is kind of standing out, like
Yeah.
definitely past few years, especially. But
I honestly,
yeah,
yeah, don't think you could do better than DMU. As far as like the Catholic Foundational, I looked into Ave Maria, I looked into
yeah,
Steubenville. DMU kind of seems to have it, but I will say there's a lot of people in my clinic right now from Pepperdine, and those people are ready, man. They're like sharp as like any tool can get. So like
yeah,
if you're local, if you want to go to Pepperdine, like
yeah,
and you think the cost is worth it, like go to Pepperdine. They're very well trained. The people that I met from there, I can't speak about the program or anything, but
mm,
those people are like
yeah,
they have their eye on the ball.
mm-hmm.
I'm glad to be in the field with them, is the only thing
Yeah.
that I can say.
Yeah, no, and that's a really good point. Is there a lot of good programs that are still more secular, like state programs, or just other private schools like Pepperdine, Christian schools, and there is that avenue, and this is kind of more the route I took of learning how to integrate the Catholic faith, like kind of on the side or after. It's like your program might be more secular and might not dive into, well, what's the faith integration, or how does the catechism fit into this theory? But that's something you can definitely do and be doing kind of simultaneously, or especially after your program, just kind of reading books that are going to help you do that and kind of plugging in. I've talked about it before, but like Bob Schuchts, his material, Be Healed,
Hmm.
does a great job of doing that. The Mindful Catholic, Greg Bottaro. So different resources like that are really helpful. Souls and Hearts is a big one too, with internal family systems and parts work. So there's a lot of good stuff out there, and so it's finding a program that's right for you and seeing what it requires of you, right? And praying, discerning what
Yeah,
is God
seriously.
calling you to do, to flourish, to live life in abundance. Yeah, and then I guess if anybody has any comments, leave them below. Hit the like and subscribe button. If anybody has questions for Josh, leave them below, and I'll send them to Josh, and he can send me the answers.
Yeah, for
Um,
sure. Working on having a website and everything,
yeah,
hopefully in the next 2 months. But if you guys have any questions for me or anything, please just put them below and I'll try to get to them.
cool, cool, cool. And you guys might be seeing and hearing a lot more of Josh too, which we'll talk about some other day. Yeah, with Colby, we got some stuff in the works coming up, which is exciting. And we all live like within 5 miles of each other, and so we got some great Catholic therapist community in one town. So good stuff. But thank you all for watching. Again, leave any comments below, hit that like and subscribe button. If you know someone who's interested in becoming a therapist, and a Catholic therapist specifically, give this episode a share. If you have any questions regarding the Catholic Therapy Center or my practice, visit the website, catholictherapycenter.com. We are a team of Catholic clinicians looking to integrate our faith and really help people pursue healing, pursue that abundance of life through the power of the Holy Spirit. And we're always looking for people who would be great to join our team, clinicians kind of finishing up their master's program or fully licensed as well. So feel free to check all that out. But thank you guys again. Thank you, Josh. And we'll see you guys next time. God bless.